welcome everyone to our session. On questions Q&A for storage security. Again, I'm Marty Fulton with the Storage Networking Industry Association, and I have with me Eric Hibbard, longtime volunteer at SNIA at Samsung Semiconductor, and also the storage security and really security expert. So I have a question for you, Eric. People talk about storage security and then they talk about security. Are there differences in people's minds that they should be aware of? Are they two separate or do they intersect when people talk about storage security and security?
Excellent question. So in my mind, storage security is a subset of security. However, we're often dealing with some specialty technology areas. So the number of security professionals that know anything about, for example, Fiber Channel or iSCSI or even many of the NAS protocols, let alone some of the new stuff like NVMe and whatnot, are it's pretty limited. However, so when we're looking at these storage technologies, trying to figure out how to secure them to the degree that's possible, we also have to keep an eye on what are the overall requirements where, so for example, 27001, when I mentioned in the talk, is the big driver for organizational ISMS certification. Well, part of that standard talks about proper media handling. So when you're done with media, for example, what do? You don't just throw it in the bin. You've got to deal with it. All right, well, that gets the specifics of how you deal with that actually get deferred to 27040, which is dealing with storage security. It in turn then looks at sort of setting up this whole concept of sanitization, whether it's logical sanitization or media-based. If it's media-based, then what happens is we're seeing a deferral to the new IEEE 2883. So there's, in some cases, a trickle-down effect. Likewise, if you were to look at how do you go about securing Fiber Channel, well, there's networking, and then when you look at 27040, it deals with storage networking, and then there's a whole plethora of ANSI standards that talk about various aspects of Fiber Channel that you actually have to know bits and pieces from maybe a dozen different documents that in totality are needed to essentially secure that kind of technology. So that's an example or a couple of examples of how storage security plays into this. It's rare that it stands all by itself. It's in general, you're dealing with protecting data, and I like to think of storage as the last line of defense. When I first started doing this back in 2004, that was absolutely not the case, and I'm here to say today that it actually has become, in many cases, that last line of defense for data, protecting data. Does that help?
That does help. So we had a question that came in. Ooh, sorry, my microphone is bad. Try that again. We had a question that came in on what standards organization owns security? Is there one that owns it?
Oh my God, no. I have a diagram that I give on certain talks. So that little bubble chart that I showed with, information security versus cybersecurity versus privacy versus data protection. Yeah, there's no one owner. In fact, there are a number of security frameworks and privacy frameworks that sometimes work together, sometimes collide. So yeah, there's not one who rules them all. But that said, you basically as an organization need to pick a framework. And and work within that framework. Doesn't matter whether it's NIST or ISO or ISF, or there's several of them. Pick it and use it. And then eventually, when you're dealing with storage, you will get to the point where there are not very many standards that are in that space. And primarily what we're seeing right now is ISO and IEEE, who are working in conjunction with each other to avoid duplication, are where you're going to see it. Now, that's the formal standardization. There's domestic stuff, and NIST, by the way, is part of the ISO work. But we have lots of these industry associations that are also defining and describing security. And some of those come to play as well, but those are not necessarily in the sort of the formal standardization space. And I'm trying to be careful to not be a standards bigot here, but that said, ISO, IEC, and ITUT tend to carry a lot of weight. When I was working on the ISO electronic discovery standard and I was in Malaysia, they were talking about just adopting the standard as regulation. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. I'm not sure. Are you sure you want to do that? Mm-hmm. So that's where some of those standards can be particularly important, because they are they're picked up and used in some countries. And I mentioned Subcommittee 27 within ISO. There are 75 countries that are currently involved in another probably 65 liaison organizations. So they are definitely a heavyweight, and they collaborate with a lot of the organizations to try and minimize duplication and confusion.
Good. We have another question that's come in. Do the hyperscalers support the standards you listed, or do they manage by their own requirements?
That's an interesting question. And obviously I can't speak for them. That said, I do chair Insight's Technical Committee, Cybersecurity and Privacy, which is its new name. It used to be nicknamed CS1. And many of the hyperscalers are represented there. So this is when the US is dealing with Subcommittee 27, that's the US entity that actually responds to and develops standards. And so a lot of the hyperscalers, the big ones, I should say, are definitely there. Some of the smaller ones, not so much yet. And I've definitely seen comments come in, as an ISO editor. I've definitely seen comments come in on, like, the storage security standard from those communities. Adoption, that's an interesting term. One way to check is to see how many of them actually have ISO 27001 certification, and that'll give you a sense of kind of their position on at least sort of all in on some of that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but there are lots of standards to choose from here.
Good. Any other questions in the audience? So I will ask one. Would you comment just for a few minutes, Eric, on the committee at SNIA, the new Data Protection and Privacy Committee? What are their goals and objectives?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I do hang out with them, partly because I chair the Security Technical Work Group, which gets involved in security aspects of a lot of the specifications. So, like, for example, I think we had a talk a little while ago about computational storage, and Security Twig is collaborating with them on threat modeling for that. The Data Protection and Privacy Committee is in some cases leveraging some of the security work that's going on in the Security Twig. Like, for example, when we're developing comments and contributions on the ISO 27040 storage security standard, they're looking at it through the lens of data preservation, data protection, and privacy. and so they're adding kind of a different perspective, where security people would maybe not be looking at the privacy element quite so much. As a privacy professional, I find that the work I'm doing over there is actually not the same work I do in the security technical work group. Another area that they've done some work, besides lots of awareness kinds of activities, so bright talks and things of that nature, we saw the European Union came out with Lot 9, which is basically, think of green server, green storage, and it had this thing called secure data deletion. And they just kind of made up what that meant. Well, the DPPC basically put together a couple of advisories for the SNIA membership to just become aware of what does this mean. Effectively, if you were selling storage with more than 400 drives in it into the EU, you had to have certain functionality, and it wasn't obvious to the storage industry that this was going on. So they were looking out again, on that front. But definitely the privacy piece. When California came out with its IoT law, looking at what exactly does this mean? Because it turns out that their definition of IoT, essentially anything with an IP address or Bluetooth, i.e. that means most storage, because most storage has a management interface. It's got swept into that, right? So again, it was, what is this? What's the potential issues, and how nasty a problem is it? Because it turns out only the Attorney General of California can actually take any action on it. There's no right of private, sort of going off and starting an adventure. So again, tracking those kinds of things and making sure that this crossover of data protection and privacy are something that doesn't get lost when we focus on just the storage and maybe the security that's relevant to it, because the privacy stuff brings definitely a weird angle, and the fines for some of this can be astronomical. In some cases, as a practicing security and privacy professional, privacy is the tail that's wagging the security dog. It really, even though it talks about things like risk-based kinds of things, if you don't have your security house in order, the fines can be measured in percentages of your annual take worldwide. That gets companies' attention pretty quickly. And I'm not saying that it's a tax system. I'm not saying that I need to build a new hospital, but data indiscretions are so easy to come by. You do have to at least have your house somewhat in order, or you could be in trouble.
All right, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, Eric. And hopefully we'll catch up soon, perhaps at the next Storage Developer Conference.
Looking forward to it. I've got at least one talk, and you might even have two.
Okay. Thanks so much. Bye now.
Bye, Marty.